"Step out of the vehicle," Officer Daniel Mercer said sharply into the night air, his hand resting near his radio as the red and blue lights behind him painted the quiet two-lane highway in pulses of authority. But what he didn't realize in that moment, what he couldn't possibly have realized yet, was that the license plate he had just run through his cruiser's computer wasn't missing because the car was stolen. It was missing because it wasn't supposed to appear in any civilian database at all. The sedan had been moving calmly just under the posted 45 miles per hour limit when Mercer first noticed it less than half a mile outside the county line. Its glossy black finish reflecting the streetlights like still water, and its government-issue style plate catching his attention in a way that felt wrong even before he could explain why. He had worked patrol for 11 years, long enough to trust the quiet signals his instincts sent him when something didn't add up, and when his onboard system returned a blank result instead of a registered owner, that instinct hardened into certainty. Stolen vehicle, he thought. Or worse. He flipped on his lights without hesitation. Ahead of him, the sedan slowed immediately, smoothly, pulling onto the shoulder with a kind of controlled precision Mercer didn't usually see during traffic stops, especially not this late on a Wednesday night, when most drivers either panicked or overcorrected. The road stretched empty for nearly a quarter mile in both directions, a lonely stretch of asphalt bordered by dark tree lines, and a single flickering street lamp about 30 yards ahead, and Mercer stepped out of his cruiser expecting confusion, excuses, maybe even resistance. Instead, the driver stayed perfectly still. Through the rear window, he could see the outline of a woman sitting upright behind the wheel, her hands resting calmly at 10 and 2 as if she had been expecting him. That detail bothered him more than the missing registration. He approached slowly, boots crunching against the gravel shoulder, body cam blinking red on his chest, cruiser lights reflecting across the sedan's rear glass in long moving streaks of color that made the entire scene feel strangely theatrical, like something already being recorded from angles he couldn't see. "License and registration," Mercer said firmly when the window lowered halfway. But the woman didn't reach for her purse right away. She looked at him first, not with fear, not with irritation, just with a quiet, steady expression that made him feel, for a brief second, like he had stepped into the middle of something already in motion long before he arrived. "Is there a reason you stopped me, officer?" she asked calmly, her voice controlled in a way that didn't match the situation Mercer believed he was handling. "This vehicle isn't showing up in the system," he replied, already shifting his stance slightly closer to the door as passing headlights appeared far down the road behind him, growing brighter as another driver approached the scene. "That usually means it doesn't belong to the person driving it." The woman didn't argue. She didn't rush. She simply studied him for another quiet second before reaching slowly toward the center console and placing her license in his hand. The name on it read Avery Carter. Mercer repeated it silently to himself as the approaching headlights slowed behind his cruiser instead of passing by, the driver lingering longer than expected, as if watching. Mercer stepped back toward his patrol car and keyed his radio. "Dispatch, confirm registration on plate number." He stopped mid-sentence when the system beeped again. Still nothing. No owner. No history. No record at all. Behind him, Avery Carter remained seated exactly the same way she had been before, hands still resting calmly on the wheel, watching him through the side mirror instead of turning around. Mercer frowned and leaned closer to his radio. "Dispatch, run the plate again." This time the response didn't come right away. For a long 3 seconds, there was only static. Then the dispatcher's voice returned, quieter than before. "Unit 12, stay with the vehicle." Mercer's grip tightened slightly around the radio as he glanced back toward the sedan, a strange feeling settling in his chest because dispatch hadn't answered his question. They hadn't confirmed the vehicle. They hadn't denied it either. They had only told him to stay exactly where he was. And suddenly, for the first time since he activated his lights, Officer Mercer began to realize that this stop might not be what he thought it was at all. Officer Daniel Mercer remained beside his patrol car longer than he intended, staring at the radio in his hand as if the silence coming through it might suddenly correct itself, but dispatch did not repeat the plate information and did not confirm ownership and did not even return to routine traffic stop language. And that alone was enough to make the stop feel different from every other roadside check he had handled in the past decade. Still, routine was routine. And Mercer reminded himself that missing database records usually meant paperwork errors or temporary tags, or sometimes drivers attempting to appear legitimate while hiding something else. So he straightened his shoulders, clipped the radio back to his vest, and walked toward the sedan again with slower, more deliberate steps than before. The approaching vehicle behind his cruiser had now come to a complete stop about 30 yards back instead of continuing down the road, its headlights angled slightly toward the shoulder as if the driver wanted a better view of what was happening. And Mercer could see the faint outline of a phone lifted inside the windshield glow, the unmistakable posture of someone recording. That alone shifted the tone of the stop. Traffic stops rarely stayed private once cameras appeared. Mercer reached the driver's side window again and held Avery Carter's license between his fingers without handing it back immediately. "Ma'am," he said carefully this time, "this vehicle is still not appearing in our system, which means I need you to step out of the car while we confirm ownership." Avery did not reach for the door handle. She did not look surprised. She did not even look irritated. Instead, she glanced once toward the rearview mirror where the cruiser lights reflected across the empty highway, and then back toward Mercer with the same calm expression she had maintained from the beginning. "Is your body camera recording this interaction, officer?" she asked quietly. The question landed in a way Mercer did not expect. Most drivers asked why they were stopped. Some asked if they were being detained. Very few asked about body cameras first. "Yes," Mercer answered automatically, tapping the blinking light on his chest as confirmation. Avery nodded once, slowly, as if that answer mattered more than anything else he had said so far. "Good," she replied, and then she rested both hands back on the steering wheel exactly where they had been before, 10 and 2, steady and visible under the rotating reflection of the emergency lights. Mercer felt the weight of the moment shift slightly again, though he could not yet explain why. He stepped back half a pace and keyed his radio once more. "Dispatch, confirm driver name Avery Carter," he said, speaking more clearly this time as the second vehicle behind his cruiser remained parked with its engine running and its phone still lifted toward the scene. The response did not come immediately. Instead, there was a faint sound of background voices on the other end of the line, not the usual calm rhythm of routine dispatch traffic, but overlapping tones that sounded like people checking something twice. Mercer frowned. "Dispatch, confirm driver name Avery Carter," he repeated. This time the reply arrived, but it did not sound routine. "Unit 12, the dispatcher said slowly. Please remain with the vehicle and do not proceed with additional enforcement steps at this time." Mercer blinked. That was not confirmation. That was not denial. That was instruction. And it was not instruction he had ever heard during a simple roadside registration stop. He glanced back toward Avery again. She had not moved. She had not opened the door. She had not even asked another question. She was simply watching him through the mirror with a calm patience that made it feel as if she already understood something he did not. Behind him, the driver filming shifted position slightly, stepping out of their own vehicle now and holding the phone higher for a clearer angle. And Mercer suddenly became aware that every word he spoke from this point forward would exist somewhere beyond the highway shoulder. He lowered his voice slightly and stepped closer to the window again. "Ma'am," he said, more carefully than before, "I still need you to step out of the vehicle while we verify ownership." Avery tilted her head just enough to meet his eyes directly for the first time since the stop began. "Officer," she said evenly, "are you certain you want to continue this stop before your department confirms what that plate actually means?" Mercer hesitated for a fraction of a second longer than he intended, because dispatch had still not answered his question about the vehicle, and somewhere behind the static of his radio another voice suddenly spoke his call sign again, this time sharper than before. The second voice on the radio did not sound like routine dispatch traffic at all, and that alone made Officer Daniel Mercer straighten instinctively beside the driver's side window as if someone higher in the chain of command had just stepped quietly into the conversation without being seen. And when the dispatcher spoke again, her tone carried a careful precision he had only heard during incidents involving restricted vehicles or protected personnel. "Unit 12, confirm your current location," she said, not asking about the driver and not asking about the plate, but asking exactly where he was standing. Mercer glanced down the empty highway out of habit before answering. "County Road 17, just south of the river crossing," he replied, watching Avery Carter through the reflection of his own cruiser lights as she remained seated exactly the same way she had been since the stop began, hands steady on the wheel, posture straight, expression calm in a way that now felt less like cooperation and more like quiet certainty. There was another pause on the radio, longer this time, and Mercer could hear movement behind the dispatcher's microphone as if someone else had stepped closer to her console. Unit 12, she said again, slower now. Do not escalate this stop until vehicle status is confirmed. Mercer frowned slightly because that phrasing was unusual. Dispatch normally confirmed status first and gave instructions second, not the other way around. He turned back, toward the window. Ma'am, I am still waiting for confirmation on this vehicle, he said, holding her license between two fingers as if the physical presence of it helped reinforce the authority of the stop, but Avery Carter did not reach for it and did not ask for it back. Instead, she glanced briefly toward the side mirror again, where the person recording from the vehicle behind the cruiser had now stepped fully onto the shoulder and was standing beside their door with their phone raised higher than before, the bright screen reflecting across the dark highway like a second set of flashing lights. Officer Mercer, Avery said quietly, and the fact that she used his name before he had introduced himself made him hesitate for a fraction of a second longer than he intended. Your dispatcher is trying to tell you something important, she continued in the same calm tone. Mercer shifted his stance slightly, instinctively aware that every movement he made was now being recorded from more than one direction. Ma'am, I need you to step out of the vehicle while we finish confirming ownership, he repeated, keeping his voice firm even though the stop no longer felt routine. Avery did not move toward the door handle. Instead, she leaned forward just enough for the cruiser lights to illuminate the edge of a leather folder resting on the passenger seat beside her, the corner of an official-looking seal barely visible where the light touched it for half a second before she rested her hand calmly back on the steering wheel again. Mercer noticed the seal, even though he could not read it clearly. It did not look like a dealership document, and it did not look like insurance paperwork. It looked official in a way that did not belong in ordinary glove compartment storage. He stepped back once more and keyed his radio again. Dispatch confirm vehicle classification, he said, more directly this time, his voice carrying the quiet tension of someone who expected an answer that would finally make the situation make sense. The response came immediately now, but it was not what he expected. Unit 12 stand by, the dispatcher said quickly, and then her microphone cut off mid-sentence as if someone else had reached over her console. Mercer lowered the radio slowly, the silence heavier than before, because dispatch radios did not usually stop mid-instruction unless someone with higher authority had just taken control of the channel. Behind him, the person recording shifted position again, stepping closer to the edge of the shoulder as if they sensed something unusual unfolding. And ahead of him, Avery Carter finally spoke once more, her voice steady and calm in the flashing light. Officer, she said quietly, before you ask me to step out again, you may want to listen very carefully to your radio when it comes back. Mercer opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, the radio at his shoulder clicked sharply back to life with a voice he did not recognize using his call sign. The unfamiliar voice that came through Officer Daniel Mercer's radio did not introduce itself the way dispatch normally did, and that alone made the air around the quiet roadside feel tighter than before, because whoever had just taken control of the channel spoke with the calm authority of someone who expected to be obeyed without explanation. Unit 12 confirm again the driver name. The voice said evenly, not rushed and not uncertain. Mercer hesitated only a second before answering. Driver name Avery Carter, he repeated, watching the woman through the reflection of the cruiser lights as she remained seated exactly where she had been since the stop began, hands steady on the wheel, as if none of this surprised her at all. There was another pause on the radio, longer this time than any before, and Mercer could hear faint background movement behind the transmission, the kind of quiet coordination that usually happened when supervisors became involved without stepping physically onto the scene yet. Unit 12, the voice continued carefully. Do not request the driver to exit the vehicle again at this time. Mercer blinked slowly because that instruction did not match the direction the stop had been moving only moments earlier, and behind him the person recording from the vehicle on the shoulder shifted closer still, their phone now clearly raised high enough to capture both Mercer and the sedan in the same frame. Mercer adjusted his stance beside the window and lowered his voice slightly. "Ma'am," he said, still holding her license between his fingers, "I am still waiting for confirmation regarding this vehicle." Avery Carter met his eyes directly for the first time since the stop began, without the reflection of the mirror between them. "I understand," she replied calmly, her tone steady enough that it sounded less like reassurance and more like certainty that confirmation was already on its way. Mercer keyed his radio again. "Dispatch confirmed vehicle classification," he repeated, because the missing registration still did not make sense and the silence around that question had become the loudest part of the stop. This time the response came immediately, but it was not the dispatcher's voice he expected. "Unit 12 remain exactly where you are," the unfamiliar voice repeated, slower now, as if each word mattered more than usual traffic stop language. Mercer glanced briefly toward the cruiser behind him, where the emergency lights continued to sweep across the shoulder in steady rotations of red and blue. And beyond that he noticed something else for the first time that made him pause without meaning to. Far down the highway behind the second vehicle that had stopped to record the scene, another pair of headlights had appeared and was approaching more slowly than normal traffic would have moved along an empty county road at this hour. The vehicle did not pass the recording driver. It slowed behind them instead. Avery followed his glance in the mirror and then returned her attention to him without speaking. "Officer Mercer," she said quietly, and again the way she used his name without hesitation made the stop feel less like a roadside check and more like something unfolding on a schedule he did not control. "Your department already knows what that plate means." Mercer tightened his grip slightly on the radio at his shoulder because dispatch still had not explained the classification, and now someone higher than dispatch appeared to be listening closely to every word he said. He stepped back half a pace from the window and keyed the microphone once more. "Confirm whether this vehicle is restricted," he said directly, deciding to ask the question in the clearest terms possible. The reply did not come immediately, but when it did the tone had changed again. "Unit 12 stand by for supervisory arrival," the voice said. Mercer froze for just a second because supervisory arrival was not standard language for a routine roadside stop, without a report of danger or escalation. Behind him, the second set of headlights that had slowed earlier came closer still, their beams now reflecting across the back of his cruiser in steady white light. And as Mercer turned slightly to look, he realized the approaching vehicle was not slowing to pass the scene at all. It was pulling onto the shoulder behind the recording driver and stopping there quietly with its engine still running and its lights still on. The vehicle that had just pulled onto the shoulder behind the recording driver did not activate emergency lights and did not sound a siren, and that alone made Officer Daniel Mercer's attention shift immediately, because law enforcement vehicles normally identified themselves long before stopping at an active roadside scene. Yet this one remained completely silent except for the steady hum of its engine and the clean white glow of its headlights stretching across the pavement behind the second car as if it were waiting rather than arriving. Mercer turned slightly to get a clearer look without stepping too far from Avery Carter's window and noticed the shape of the vehicle first. Not a patrol cruiser and not a marked county unit, but a dark government-style sport utility vehicle with tinted windows and a front grille that reflected light differently than civilian models usually did. The kind of vehicle he had seen only a few times during coordinated operations that involved agencies outside his department. Behind him, the person recording the stop shifted again and stepped closer to the shoulder line, as if sensing the moment had changed, raising their phone higher to capture both vehicles now sitting quietly behind Mercer's cruiser. Avery followed Mercer's glance through the mirror again, and then returned her attention forward without speaking, her hands still resting calmly on the steering wheel, in the same steady position she had maintained since the stop began, as if she had expected that vehicle to arrive long before he noticed it. Mercer keyed his radio again, his voice lower now, without meaning to be. "Dispatch confirms supervisory unit approaching my location," he said carefully, because the presence of an unmarked government vehicle on a routine registration stop did not match anything he had been trained to expect. The response came immediately this time, but again it was not the dispatcher's voice. "Unit 12 remain with the vehicle," the unfamiliar voice repeated, the same calm tone returning to the channel as before, and then after a brief pause the voice added something Mercer had never heard during a roadside stop in his entire career. Do not initiate tow authorization. Mercer froze for half a second because he had not yet requested a tow over the radio and had not announced that decision out loud, which meant someone listening to the channel already knew exactly what step he had been preparing to take next. He lowered the microphone slowly and glanced once more toward Avery Carter. She had not moved. She had not opened the door. She had not even asked another question. Instead, she watched him with the same quiet patience that now felt less like cooperation and more like someone waiting for a process she already understood to finish unfolding. Mercer shifted his weight and stepped back toward the rear of her vehicle slightly to get a clearer view past the recording driver's car, and as he did, the passenger side door of the dark sport utility vehicle behind them opened without urgency, and one figure stepped out onto the shoulder wearing a dark suit instead of a uniform. The person did not approach immediately. They simply stood beside the vehicle for a moment as if observing the scene before deciding whether to move closer. Mercer felt the stop change again in that instant because suited personnel did not appear during routine vehicle checks unless something far above ordinary patrol jurisdiction had already been triggered. He keyed his radio once more. "Dispatch, identify additional unit on scene," he said directly now, no longer trying to keep the uncertainty out of his voice. The reply came slower this time. "Unit 12 remain in position," the unfamiliar voice repeated again, and then after another pause it added quietly, "Await contact." Mercer lowered the radio and looked back toward Avery Carter one more time, noticing for the first time that the leather folder resting on the passenger seat beside her had shifted slightly in the reflection of the lights, and that the edge of the official seal visible along its corner now caught the cruiser's rotating beam clearly enough to reveal that it was not a county insignia at all, but something issued at a higher level than anything his department normally handled. The moment Officer Daniel Mercer recognized that the seal inside the leather folder on the passenger seat did not belong to any county office he had ever worked with, something inside the structure of the stop shifted again in a way he could not ignore anymore. Because patrol officers learned early in their careers to recognize jurisdiction markers even from partial glimpses, and that seal did not belong to local enforcement. It did not belong to municipal administration, and it did not belong to anything he would normally encounter during a roadside registration check on a quiet county road at night. Mercer stepped half a pace closer to the driver's side window again, without realizing he had done it, his attention returning to Avery Carter as she remained seated exactly the same way she had been since the cruiser lights first appeared behind her vehicle nearly 10 minutes earlier, her posture still composed, her hands still visible, her expression still calm in a way that no longer looked like compliance, but instead looked like patience. "Ma'am," Mercer said carefully now, his tone noticeably different from when the stop began. "I am still waiting for confirmation regarding the classification of this vehicle." Avery met his eyes directly again, and this time there was something new in her expression, not surprise and not concern but recognition, as if she understood that he had finally noticed the detail he was supposed to see. "I believe your confirmation is already on the way," she replied quietly. Behind Mercer, the suited individual who had stepped out of the dark sport utility vehicle began walking forward along the shoulder with slow measured steps that carried none of the urgency of patrol response and none of the hesitation of someone unsure whether they belonged at the scene. Mercer turned slightly to watch the approach without stepping away from Avery's window and noticed immediately that the individual was not reaching for identification while walking and was not speaking into a radio and was not signaling toward him in any way at all, which meant the approach itself was deliberate rather than reactive. Mercer keyed his radio again instinctively. "Dispatch, confirm identity of approaching personnel," he said, his voice lower than before. The reply came immediately, but once again it was not the dispatcher's voice he heard. "Unit 12 remain with the vehicle," the unfamiliar voice repeated, the same calm authority returning to the channel for the fourth time since the stop began, and then after a pause the voice added something Mercer had never heard directed at him during any roadside stop in 11 years of patrol service. "Do not request the driver's removal from the vehicle." Mercer lowered the microphone slowly and glanced back toward Avery Carter again, noticing now that she had shifted one hand slightly from the steering wheel toward the leather folder resting beside her, not opening it and not lifting it, but simply resting her fingertips lightly along its edge as if preparing for a moment that had already been scheduled before either of them arrived on this stretch of road. The suited individual stopped approximately 15 feet behind Mercer's cruiser and remained there without speaking, their presence alone enough to confirm that whatever classification dispatch had been trying to verify earlier had now reached the scene physically instead of electronically. Mercer looked once more toward the second vehicle still recording the stop and realized that the driver holding the phone had not left and had not lowered the camera and had not even stepped back despite the arrival of the additional vehicle behind them, which meant the entire sequence of events unfolding on the shoulder of County Road 17 was now being preserved from beginning to end by someone who had arrived at exactly the right moment to witness it. Avery spoke again quietly before Mercer could return to the radio. "Officer Mercer," she said calmly, "your department is not waiting for confirmation anymore." Mercer felt the weight of those words settle before he fully understood what they meant, and as he turned slightly toward the approaching suited figure again, he realized the person was no longer stopping behind the cruiser, but had begun walking directly toward him with a steady pace that suggested the confirmation he had been requesting since the beginning of the stop had finally arrived in person. The suited man did not rush as he approached Officer Daniel Mercer, and that alone changed the rhythm of the roadside stop more than any flashing light or radio instruction could have, because people who arrived late to routine patrol scenes usually moved quickly to catch up with events already unfolding. But this man walked with the quiet confidence of someone who already knew exactly what had happened before he stepped out of his vehicle. Mercer turned fully to face him now, instinctively adjusting his stance as the man stopped just a few feet away without raising his voice and without displaying urgency, simply offering a brief nod that carried the unmistakable weight of official presence. "Officer Mercer," the man said calmly, and the fact that he spoke Mercer's name before any introduction confirmed what Mercer had already begun to suspect, that this arrival was not accidental and not observational, but intentional. Mercer straightened slightly. "Sir," he replied, waiting for identification that had not yet been shown. The man reached slowly inside his jacket and produced a credential wallet, opening it just enough for Mercer to see the seal inside under the sweep of the cruiser lights. And in that instant, Mercer understood why dispatch had never confirmed the plate classification over the radio. The seal matched the one he had glimpsed earlier resting inside the leather folder on Avery Carter's passenger seat. It was not county. It was not municipal. It was issued at the state level. "You can return her license," the man said evenly, not as a suggestion and not as a request, but as a simple statement of what was expected next. Mercer hesitated only a fraction of a second before turning back toward the driver's side window, where Avery Carter remained seated exactly as she had been since the beginning of the stop, her hands still resting calmly on the steering wheel, as if she had been waiting for this exact moment to arrive. Mercer extended her license back toward her through the open window, and she accepted it without speaking, her expression unchanged, but her eyes meeting his for just long enough to confirm that the situation had shifted permanently. Behind them, the recording driver remained on the shoulder with the phone still raised, capturing every movement in silence, and the dark sport utility vehicle behind the cruiser idled quietly, with its headlights steady against the pavement, as if it had been part of the scene from the beginning rather than something that had just arrived. Mercer turned back toward the suited man. "Sir, I was attempting to confirm vehicle registration status," he said carefully, aware now that every word he spoke carried more weight than before. The man nodded once. "The vehicle registration status is correct," he replied calmly. Mercer blinked. "Correct," he repeated quietly, because that single word explained the missing database record more clearly than dispatch ever could have. The suited man glanced briefly toward Avery Carter's vehicle and then back toward Mercer again. "There are some vehicles that do not appear in civilian patrol systems," he said evenly. "This is one of them." Mercer felt the full meaning of that sentence settle slowly into place as the cruiser lights continued to rotate across the quiet highway shoulder, and the recording phone behind him remained steady in the air. He looked once more toward Avery Carter and noticed that her hand now rested lightly along the edge of the leather folder beside her seat again, the same folder bearing the same seal he had already seen twice in different places within the last minute. The suited man spoke again before Mercer could ask another question. "Officer Mercer," he said calmly, "you were instructed not to request that she exit the vehicle." Mercer opened his mouth slightly, but stopped before answering because he had indeed repeated that instruction earlier despite the warnings coming through his radio. The suited man did not raise his voice. He did not accuse. He simply nodded once toward the sedan. "There is a reason for that instruction," he said quietly, and then after a brief pause he added the words Mercer had not expected to hear. Spoken aloud on a roadside shoulder in the middle of a routine traffic stop. "You have been speaking with the state attorney." Officer Daniel Mercer did not respond immediately after the suited man spoke those words because the meaning of them did not settle all at once, but arrived in pieces, the same way the stop itself had unfolded piece by piece since the moment he first activated his lights behind the black sedan nearly 15 minutes earlier. And as he turned slowly back toward the driver's side window, he noticed for the first time that Avery Carter had already picked up the leather folder resting on the passenger seat beside her and was holding it calmly across her lap as if the moment to open it had finally arrived. She did not rush. She did not raise her voice. She simply opened the folder and turned it slightly, so the seal inside caught the rotating reflection of the cruiser lights clearly enough for Mercer to see it without needing to lean closer. And what he saw matched exactly what the suited man had shown him only seconds earlier. State-level authority. Not symbolic. Not ceremonial. Official. Mercer felt the structure of the stop shift completely in that instant because everything he had been waiting for dispatch to confirm since the beginning of the encounter was now sitting in plain view only a few feet away from him. Avery spoke quietly but clearly enough that both Mercer and the suited man standing behind him could hear every word. "Officer Mercer," she said evenly, "my office issued that vehicle classification." The words were not defensive and they were not corrective. They were simply factual. Mercer nodded once without meaning to, the motion small but unmistakable as he stepped back half a pace from the window, instinctively creating space where only minutes earlier he had been preparing to request that she exit the vehicle again. Behind him, the person recording the stop shifted slightly, but did not lower their phone, and the second dark vehicle remained parked silently along the shoulder as if its presence had never been temporary at all. Mercer keyed his radio once more without speaking into it at first, listening instead to the quiet channel that had guided him through the stop from the beginning. But this time no instruction came and no unfamiliar voice interrupted because the confirmation he had been requesting was no longer coming through the radio. It was already standing beside him and already seated in front of him at the same time. The suited man stepped forward half a step and spoke again with the same calm tone he had maintained since arriving. "Officer Mercer," he said evenly, "the vehicle you stopped is assigned to the office of the state attorney." Mercer lowered his hand from the radio slowly and turned back toward Avery Carter once more, noticing now that the calm patience she had maintained since the beginning of the stop no longer felt like anticipation, but like closure, as if she had been waiting not for recognition, but for the process to finish unfolding on its own. Avery closed the folder gently and rested it again across her lap before speaking one more time. "Your dispatcher recognized the plate immediately," she said quietly. "That is why they asked you to remain with the vehicle." Mercer exhaled slowly, not realizing until that moment how long he had been holding tension in his shoulders since the stop began. And as he looked once more toward the cruiser lights reflecting across the empty stretch of County Road 17, he understood that every instruction he had received over the radio had been guiding him away from escalation rather than toward enforcement. The suited man spoke again before Mercer could respond. "Your department supervisor is already on the way," he said calmly. Mercer looked up at that statement instinctively because supervisory arrival had been mentioned earlier but had not yet materialized on the roadway. And as he turned slightly toward the far end of the shoulder, he noticed a new set of headlights approaching from the direction of the county line, moving steadily toward the scene, with the unmistakable rhythm of a marked unit closing distance without urgency, but without hesitation either. The marked unit approaching from the county line did not activate its siren as it closed the final stretch of distance toward the shoulder of County Road 17, but Officer Daniel Mercer recognized the vehicle immediately even before the headlights slowed behind his cruiser because the silhouette and light bar pattern belonged to Sheriff Robert Hale's command unit. And the realization alone confirmed that the situation unfolding beside the quiet roadside was no longer a routine traffic stop, but something that had already reached the highest level of authority inside his department. The sheriff stepped out of the vehicle without urgency and without raising his voice, closing the driver door behind him with a calm motion that carried the unmistakable presence of someone who already understood everything that had happened before he arrived. Mercer straightened instinctively as the sheriff approached, aware that the suited official remained just behind him and that Avery Carter was still seated inside the sedan with the leather folder resting calmly across her lap, exactly where it had been when the confirmation of her position became clear only moments earlier. Sheriff Hale stopped beside Mercer first, not at the window and not beside the sedan, but directly beside the patrol car, as if the first conversation of the evening was meant to happen between officers rather than across the driver's side door. "Officer Mercer," the sheriff said evenly, his voice calm but unmistakably deliberate. "Step away from the vehicle." Mercer obeyed immediately, moving 2 careful steps back from the window and turning fully toward the sheriff as the cruiser lights continued their steady rotation across the empty highway shoulder, and the recording driver remained quietly in place with the phone still raised, capturing every movement that followed. The sheriff glanced briefly toward Avery Carter and gave a small respectful nod that carried none of the tension Mercer had felt earlier in the stop and none of the uncertainty that had filled the radio channel only minutes before. "Ma'am," he said calmly, and Avery returned the nod without opening the door or stepping out, her composure unchanged from the moment the stop began. The sheriff then turned back toward Mercer again. "This vehicle is assigned through the office of the state attorney," he said clearly, his words leaving no room for confusion and no need for further confirmation through dispatch. Mercer nodded once, the motion slower this time because the explanation he had been waiting for since the beginning of the stop had now been delivered face-to-face by the highest authority on scene. The sheriff continued speaking, his tone steady and measured in a way that suggested the conversation was already part of an official record rather than an informal correction. "Your dispatcher attempted to advise you earlier," he said quietly. Mercer felt the meaning of that sentence settle immediately because he remembered every instruction that had come through the radio since the moment the plate returned blank in the system. The sheriff rested one hand briefly on the roof edge of the patrol car and then looked toward the cruiser lights reflecting across the roadway, as if acknowledging the length of time the stop had already occupied the shoulder. "Body camera remains active," he added calmly, not as a warning but as a reminder. Mercer nodded again. "Yes, sir," he answered. Behind him, the suited official stepped slightly closer but did not interrupt, and Avery Carter remained seated inside the sedan exactly as she had been from the beginning, watching the exchange without speaking. The sheriff turned once more toward Mercer before concluding the conversation. "You are cleared to return to patrol after documentation review," he said evenly. Mercer understood what that meant without needing additional explanation because documentation review did not happen after ordinary registration stops unless the event itself had already become part of something larger than routine enforcement. He glanced once more toward Avery Carter as she rested the leather folder quietly back on the passenger seat beside her and returned both hands to the steering wheel in the same calm position she had held from the start. For the first time since the cruiser lights came on behind her vehicle, Mercer realized that she had never raised her voice and never argued and never even needed to explain who she was. She had simply waited. And as Sheriff Hale stepped back toward his command vehicle and the suited official returned toward the dark sport utility vehicle behind the scene, Mercer stood beside his patrol car, watching the quiet shoulder of County Road 17 return slowly to stillness. Understanding at last that he had not stopped the suspicious driver that night, but had instead stopped the office responsible for deciding what happened next inside his own department.